The sterile, biting scent of antiseptic was the first thing that assaulted my senses, a sharp contrast to the cloying, sweet aroma of dark chocolate that still lingered phantom-like in my memory. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitors in the pediatric ICU was the only sound in the world that mattered. It was a countdown, a metronome keeping time for lives that had barely begun. My grandchildren, Leo and Maya, lay in those hospital beds, pale and hooked up to machines that looked far too large for their small bodies. I stood behind the glass partition, my reflection staring back at me. I saw a ghost. I saw a woman of 72 years who had thought she understood the nature of love and sacrifice, only to have her reality shattered into a million jagged shards. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It had been buzzing incessantly for the last hour. The screen lit up with the name that used to make my heart swell with pride, but now made my bile rise: Julian, my son. I stepped away from the window, my hand trembling as I pressed the phone to my ear. I did not speak. I needed to hear his voice first. I needed to know if the monster hiding beneath the skin of the boy I raised would reveal itself. Mom? Mom? Answer me. Julian's voice was tight, high-pitched with a panic that a stranger might mistake for concern. Did you get the package? Did you eat the truffles? Why aren't you answering my texts? The specific nature of his questions sent a chill down my spine that was colder than the Seattle rain battering the hospital windows. He wasn't asking how I was, he was asking if I had consumed the poison. I didn't eat them, Julian, I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears, hollow. Detached? Dead. There was a pause on the other end. A silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Then, a sigh. A distinct, audible exhale of relief that twisted instantly into aggression. Thank God, he breathed out, but then the tone shifted. Wait, so where are they? You didn't throw them away, did you? Those were imported, Mom. They cost a fortune. I gave them to Sarah and the kids, I said. The words were simple, factual, yet they carried the weight of a death sentence. The scream that tore through the speaker was not human. It was the sound of a cornered animal, a primal howl of terror that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with consequences. You did what? You gave them to the kids? Are you insane? Tell me you're lying, Mom. Tell me you ate them. They are in the ICU, Julian, I whispered, tears finally spilling over, hot and angry. The doctors found traces of arsenic. The police are on their way to your house right now. He didn't ask if his children were alive. He didn't ask which hospital we were at. He simply uttered a curse word, foul and venomous, and the line went dead. That was the moment Evelyn Vance died. The soft-spoken, retired literature teacher who had spent her life making herself smaller so her son could feel big, she died right there in the corridor of Seattle Grace Hospital. And from her ashes, something cold, hard, and terrifyingly clear-eyed began to rise. To understand how a mother reaches the point where she declares war on her own flesh and blood, you have to understand the 40 years of blindness that preceded it. I am Evelyn. For decades, my life was a singular orbit around the sun that was Julian. I adopted him when he was 3 years old, a foster child with eyes full of fear and a heart guarded by high walls. I was a single woman in my 30s, a teacher who wanted nothing more than to pour her love into a child. I gave him my name, my home, and every ounce of my energy. I funded his private schools by tutoring late into the night. I paid for his university degrees that he never quite utilized. I bailed him out of failed business ventures, a tech startup that never started, a real estate flip that flopped. I was his safety net, his bank, his constant apologist. When he married Sarah, a kind-hearted nurse who worked double shifts to support his lifestyle, I thought he would settle down. But Julian resented Sarah's practicality. He resented her exhaustion. He filled her head with lies about me, that I was overbearing, that I was critical, that I was a burden. She's just lonely, Sarah, he would say within my earshot. She's old and she forgets things. Just ignore her. Slowly, I was pushed to the periphery of their lives. I became the Sunday dinner guest who was tolerated, not welcomed. But I accepted it. I accepted the scraps of affection because I believed that deep down, the bond between a mother and son was unbreakable. Then came my 72nd birthday. I had spent the morning alone, reading near the fireplace in my modest bungalow in Queen Anne. The rain was relentless, matching my mood. I hadn't heard from Julian in weeks. When the doorbell rang, I expected a package from Amazon, perhaps a book I had ordered. Instead, the courier handed me an exquisite box, wrapped in midnight blue velvet. The card, embossed with gold lettering, read, "To the woman who gave me everything. Happy birthday, Mom. Love, Julian." Inside lay 12 artisanal dark chocolate truffles dusted with gold flakes. They looked like jewels. They smelled of rich cocoa and promise. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at them, tears misting my eyes. I thought this was it. I thought this was the olive branch. I thought my son had finally remembered me. But then, that insidious voice of self-deprecation, the one I had cultivated over years of putting others first, whispered in my ear, "These are too rich for you, Evelyn. You have high blood sugar. You shouldn't indulge." Sarah loves dark chocolate. The twins, Leo and Maya, would be so excited to see these fancy candies. It was a habit, a reflex. I always deferred my joy to them. So, I closed the box. I put on my raincoat and drove the 20 minutes to their house in Ballard. When Sarah opened the door, she looked exhausted. Her scrubs were wrinkled, and her eyes were shadowed with fatigue. But when I handed her the box, explaining that Julian had sent them but I wanted to share, her face softened. "Oh, Evelyn," she sighed, taking the velvet box. That's surprisingly thoughtful of him. And sweet of you to share. Come in, please." We sat in the kitchen. Leo and Maya, 7 and 9 years old, came running in, their eyes widening at the gold-dusted treats. I didn't take one. I said I had a stomach ache, a small white lie to let them have more. I watched them eat. Sarah had one, the children had 2 each. They laughed. For 20 minutes, we were a family. Then the vomiting started. It wasn't a normal stomach bug. It was violent, immediate, and terrifying. Sarah, utilizing her nursing training, realized instantly that this was chemical. She screamed for me to call 911 while she tried to induce vomiting in the children. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and terror. And now, standing in the hallway after that phone call with Julian, the pieces of the puzzle slammed together with the force of a physical blow. The gift, after months of silence. The expensive, bitter dark chocolate that would mask the taste of a metallic powder. The panic in his voice when he thought the plan had gone awry. The relief when he thought I hadn't eaten them. The rage when he realized his real family, his wife and children, were the victims. Julian hadn't just forgotten my birthday. He had used it as a date of execution. 2 days later, the children were stable. The doctors said the dose per truffle was high, but because they had shared them and vomited so quickly, they would survive. Sarah, however, was broken. She sat by Maya's bed, holding her daughter's hand, her face a mask of shock. I sat across from her. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady, "we need to talk about Julian." She looked up, her eyes red. "The police. They found arsenic in his home office, in a jar labeled rat poison. They issued an arrest warrant, but he's gone. His car isn't at the house. He's at his sister's," I said. "My biological daughter, Clara. She lives in Portland. He always runs to her when he breaks something." Sarah looked confused. "I didn't know you had a daughter." "I don't talk about her," I admitted. "She and we are estranged. She believes Julian is a saint and I am the villain. But I know him. He's a coward. He won't go far." "Why?" Sarah whispered, the question hanging in the air like smoke. "Why would he do this? We have money troubles, sure, but murder?" "Not just murder," I corrected her. "Inheritance. I have an insurance policy, Sarah, and savings. A significant amount that I accumulated over 40 years of frugal living. Julian thinks I have about $200,000. He's wrong. It's closer to $1 million. Sarah's jaw dropped. $1 million? Compound interest and a modest lifestyle, I said. He wanted a payday. He wanted to clear his debts, whatever they are, with my life insurance. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in my skirt. "Focus on the children, Sarah. I have work to do." I didn't go to the police immediately to tell them where he was. I needed to see him. I needed to look him in the eye, 1 last time. I rented a car, not wanting to use my own. and drove 3 hours south to Portland. My daughter Clara's house was a chaotic mess, much like her life. When I knocked, she answered with a cigarette dangling from her lips, her expression shifting from boredom to hostility when she recognized me. "Mom? What the hell are you doing here?" "I know he's here, Clara," I said, pushing past her into the living room. And there he was. Julian was sitting on the ragged sofa, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching the news with the volume turned low. He looked up, and for a second, he looked like the toddler who used to cry when it thundered. But then his eyes hardened. There was no remorse, only the petulant anger of a child whose toy had been taken away. "You ruined everything," he spat at me. "As usual. You just couldn't die, could you? You had to be the martyr and give away the chocolates." "The children almost died, Julian," I said, my voice eerily calm. "They'll be fine," he dismissed, waving his hand. "Sarah is a drama queen. But you are a burden. You've been a burden my whole life, hovering, judging, controlling." "I paid for your life," I said. "I paid for this shirt you're wearing. I paid for the car you drove here." "That's your job," he shouted, standing up. "You adopted me. You owed me. And now what? You're going to hoard that money until you're 90 while I drown in debt? I needed that money now. I have people after me, Mom. Dangerous people. If I don't pay them 50 grand by next week, I'm dead anyway." The revelation hung in the room. It wasn't just greed, it was desperation. Gambling debts, likely. Or loan sharks. "So you decided to trade my life for your debt," I concluded. "It would have been painless," he sneered. "A heart attack in your sleep. Old ladies die all the time. But no, you had to be generous. You had to be the saint." Clara stood in the doorway, looking between us. "Julian, is that true? You actually—" "Shut up, Clara," he snapped. She pushed me to this. I looked at him, really looked at him. I searched for any trace of the boy I had loved. I looked for the son who had made me macaroni art, the teenager I had taught to drive. He was gone, consumed by entitlement and narcissism. "You're right, Julian," I said softly. "I was a burden. I burdened you with a lack of consequences. I crippled you by fixing everything. I loved you too much to let you fail, and in doing so, I created a monster." I turned to the door. "Where are you going?" he demanded. "You're not going to the police. You can't. I'm your son. You love me too much." I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. I looked back over my shoulder. "The mother who loved you blindly died in that hospital hallway," I said. "The woman standing here is just a witness." I walked out. I sat in my rental car and called the lead detective. "He is at 405 Oak Street, Portland. And detective, be careful. He has nothing left to lose." I waited until the sirens wailed in the distance, watching as the flashing lights surrounded the house. I watched them drag him out in handcuffs, kicking and screaming like a toddler. Only then did I drive away. But putting him in prison was not enough. The legal system was slow, and Julian was manipulative. He would play the victim. He would try to plead insanity or coerce Sarah. I needed a total, systematic dismantling of his power. I returned to Seattle and hired Marcus Thorne. Marcus was not a family lawyer. He was a corporate shark who specialized in hostile takeovers. He was expensive, aggressive, and utterly devoid of sentimentality. "Mrs. Vance," Marcus said, sitting in his glass-walled office overlooking the Sound. "This is a criminal case. The district attorney handles this. The DA handles the prison time." I corrected him. "I want you to handle the destruction of his legacy. I want to sue him for emotional distress, for attempted murder, for fraud. I want to freeze every asset he has. I want to ensure that even if he gets out in 20 years, he comes out to a scorched earth." Marcus smiled, a shark smelling blood. "We can do that." The transformation began. I sold my bungalow. I couldn't live in the house where I had raised him. I moved into a penthouse apartment in downtown Seattle, a place of steel and glass and light. I hired a stylist. I cut my gray hair into a sharp, modern bob. I traded my cardigans for tailored blazers and silk scarves. I wasn't hiding. I was arming myself. I went to see Sarah. She was staying with her parents, terrified and broke. The house was in Julian's name, and the bank was threatening foreclosure due to unpaid mortgage payments Julian had claimed he was making. "I can't fight him, Evelyn," Sarah cried. "He's calling me from jail collect. He says it was a mistake, that he was hallucinations. He wants me to testify for him." "Sign this," I said, sliding a document across the table. "What is it?" "It's a transfer of debt," I explained. "I bought the mortgage note from the bank this morning. I own your house now. You and the children can live there rent-free for as long as you like. In exchange, I need you to file for divorce and a restraining order immediately. And I need you to give Marcus full access to Julian's financial records." Sarah looked at me, stunned. You bought the house?" "I am securing my grandchildren's future," I said. "Julian is the past. We are the future." The discovery phase of the lawsuits revealed the extent of Julian's rot. He had stolen from his previous employers. He had taken out credit cards in his children's names. He had second mortgages. He was a black hole of consumption. We leaked it all. I didn't give interviews to the tabloids. I gave them to the reputable financial journals. "The Psychology of Elder Financial Abuse," the headlines read. I became the face of a silent epidemic. I wasn't the weeping mother. I was the whistleblower. The trial was a media circus. Julian's defense attorney tried to paint me as a controlling matriarch who had driven her son to madness. "She used money to control him?" the lawyer shouted, pointing an accusing finger at me in the witness stand. I leaned into the microphone. "I used money to feed him," I replied calmly, "to educate him, to house him. If generosity is a weapon, then yes, I am guilty. But last I checked, paying someone's rent is not justification for poisoning their children with arsenic." The jury didn't just deliberate, they rushed to judgment. It took them less than 3 hours. Guilty on 2 counts of attempted murder, guilty on 1 count of first-degree assault, guilty on multiple counts of fraud. When the judge asked if I had a victim impact statement, I stood up. I was wearing a blood-red suit, a color I would never have worn in my old life. "Your Honor," I said, my voice projecting to the back of the room without a tremor. "For 40 years, I confused love with enablement. I thought that by shielding my son from the consequences of his actions, I was protecting him. I was wrong. I was robbing him of his humanity. A man who never feels rain, never learns to build a shelter. A man who never feels hunger, never learns to hunt. I fed him until he forgot how to eat, and in his hunger, he tried to devour me." I looked directly at Julian. He was gaunt, pale, shivering in his orange jumpsuit. "I am not a victim," I continued. "I am a survivor of my own bad parenting. And today, I am finally giving my son the greatest gift I can offer: consequences." The judge sentenced him to 30 years without the possibility of parole. Julian screamed as they dragged him away. "Mom, you can't do this. I'm your son." I watched him go, and I felt lightness. The heavy anchor I had dragged for 4 decades had finally been cut loose. 5 years passed. The Evelyn Vance Foundation for Elder Justice became a force to be reckoned with in Washington state. We lobbied for stricter laws regarding financial guardianship. We created shelters for older women who had been swindled by their families. I traveled, giving speeches, not as a cautionary tale, but as a warrior queen. I reclaimed my life. I learned to paint. I traveled to Italy, a dream I had deferred for 20 years because Julian might need me. I drank wine on Tuscan terraces and learned that life did not end at 70. For me, it had just begun. Sarah remarried, a kind man who treated Leo and Maya as his own. The children, now teenagers, visited me every Sunday at the penthouse. We ate honest, good food. We laughed. We never talked about the man in the cell at Walla Walla State Penitentiary until the letter arrived. It was written on cheap prison paper. The handwriting was jagged. "Dear Mom, the prison chaplain says I should write this. He says I need to make amends. I'm sick, Mom. The prison doctors say it's my liver. It's failing. I don't have much time. I'm scared. I'm alone in here. Clara stopped visiting years ago. Sarah hates me. You're the only one who ever really loved me. Please, come visit. Just once. I need to see your face before I go. I need to hear you say you forgive me. Love, Julian." I sat on my balcony, the cold wind off Elliott Bay tugging at my hair. I held the letter in my hand. The old Evelyn, the ghost who died in the hospital, would have rushed to him. She would have wanted to soothe his brow, to ease his passing, to offer that final, fatal drop of unconditional forgiveness. But I was no longer that woman. I went inside and sat at my desk. I took out my heavy, cream-colored stationery and my fountain pen. Julian, I received your letter. I am sorry to hear that you are ill. No mother wishes for her child to suffer. However, I will not be visiting. You ask for forgiveness because you are afraid, not because you are sorry. You ask for my presence to comfort you, without a single thought for the comfort you stole from your children or the life you tried to steal from me. My forgiveness is not a commodity you can claim on your deathbed. It is something I gave myself years ago. I forgave myself for loving you too much and for failing to teach you right from wrong. You are alone, Julian, because you chose to be the center of a universe that does not exist. You chose to burn bridges to keep yourself warm. Now, you must sit in the ashes. Goodbye, Evelyn. I mailed the letter. 3 weeks later, the warden called. Julian had passed away in the prison infirmary. He died alone. We held a small, private service. No tears were shed, save for a few from Sarah, mourning the husband he could have been, not the man he was. As I stood by the grave, watching the earth cover the casket, my granddaughter Maya, now 16 and sharp as a tack, took my hand. "Grandma?" she asked softly. "Do you miss him?" I looked at the headstone. It was simple. Julian Vance, 1990 to 2025. I miss the little boy who used to catch frogs in the creek, I said honestly. I miss the potential he had, but I do not miss the man who tried to destroy us. I turned to her, squeezing her hand. Remember this, Maya. Love is not a blank check. It is not a license to be abused. True love requires respect. If someone demands you set yourself on fire to keep them warm, that is not love. That is parasitism. I know, Grandma, she said, resting her head on my shoulder. You taught us that. We walked back to the car, leaving the graveyard behind. The sun was breaking through the eternal Seattle clouds, casting shafts of golden light onto the wet pavement. I was 79 years old. I had scars on my heart that would never fully fade. I had lost a son, but I had found myself. I had traded a toxic illusion for a brutal, beautiful reality. And as I drove my family home, heading towards a dinner filled with laughter and safety, I realized that the truffles had been a gift after all. They were the bitter poison that had finally cured me of my blindness. They were the price of admission to a life where I was no longer a victim, but the author of my own story. The road ahead was clear. And for the first time in 40 years, I was driving with my eyes wide open,